on stage to share some of the insights that we've seen from our global operation, and in the Awin report. Before we are also inviting the expert panel. So with that, come on up.
Hi, thanks for having me today. This is actually my first time in America, so this is quite the experience. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the Awin report. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's the big publication that we do every year around affiliate marketing and the state of the industry across the globe. And essentially today I wanted to kind of give you a potted history of the Awin report, the new edition, some of the themes that we covered within it, and also, I guess, some wider context around why we took it in the direction that we did in 2019. As Alex mentioned at the outset, we'll be having a trio of interviews with 3 of the contributors to the report this year after I've finished. So hopefully you'll get a bit of a taste not only from my perspective, but also of theirs around where affiliate marketing is right now, which should be interesting. So without further ado, the Awin report. Hopefully you'll be able to pick up a copy for yourself. It is a fairly big tome this year. I think this is the biggest one that we've actually ever produced. It's over 200 pages. So if you've flown in and you're worried about your baggage, then I'd suggest that maybe you get the digital interactive version instead, which I'll give you a link to at the end of this presentation. But these are freely available today, and I do encourage you to kind of pick up a copy and have a flick through. I'll be doing signed copies afterwards as well, but only ironically, obviously. So the first edition of the Awin report, just to give you some context behind why we actually produced it in the very first place, was back in 2017. And at the time, there was never really any kind of global definitive guide to affiliate marketing as far as we were aware, and nothing that had really taken a kind of global view on how all those different markets operated within the channel and what the local differences might be. And because Awin at the time was growing as a business itself through its acquisitions and its partnerships with the likes of ShareASale, and we were kind of growing our own actual breadth and coverage as a network. And that meant that we kind of have coverage across, North and South America, throughout Europe, and with the partnership with Commission Factory that we have as well, we had kind of a bridge into the APAC market as well. So that meant at the same time that a lot of our clients, our advertisers and our publishers who were keen to understand how they could grow their businesses internationally as well, were very keen to understand how affiliate marketing operated in all of those different markets. And unlike, I think, other online ad models, which perhaps are slightly more standardized, slightly more homogenous in their functionality to a degree, if you're doing kind of search advertising or PPC or Facebook advertising or display, a lot of those practices can be relatively standardized regardless of which market you go into. Affiliate marketing tends to be quite an organic thing that grows quite specifically out of the context of that particular digital market. So what is popular in one region might not be identical to another, and that has a real influence how you incentivize your partners and build your program itself. So, for instance, in America here and also in the UK, we see obviously incentive partners, coupon, cashback, voucher code, are extremely popular with consumers there. But that differs slightly to another region, say like Benelux, where price comparison is a hugely important aspect of that market, and the quality of product feeds from advertisers are pivotal in terms of their success and effectiveness. And for somewhere like Australia, where social media also has an extremely influential, excuse the pun, but influential kind of aspect to kind of engaging with audiences out there. So the report essentially in 2017 and the follow-up the following year was designed to give that understanding of those local markets and provide people with, I guess, a more intimate understanding of what was going on the ground in those markets. But at the same time, we also wanted to identify those consistent themes that we saw as commonalities throughout the global market itself. So things like questions of incrementality that crop up everywhere, how smartphones were disrupting the consumer experience online and what that meant for affiliate marketing programs, the increasing popularity of using influencers within programs and how you effectively incentivize them. These were all questions that were common and persistent throughout all of those markets, and we wrote a lot of that content to kind of reflect on and discuss those same themes. So in 2019, though, we've actually decided to change tack slightly. So a lot of that content previously was written from a very network-centric point of view. It was being written by myself and Kevin Edwards, who is our client strategy director. You'll hear more from him tomorrow. But we were writing a lot of that content ourselves, and it was very much coming from quite a centralized point of view. And for 2019, we decided that actually we wanted to go out into the industry and to ask people more about what they felt was happening as far as affiliate marketing was concerned, and to really gauge what it was like in all of those different individual markets and across all of those different businesses. So we incorporated a huge variety of different businesses and perspectives within that particular market, within that particular report. And ultimately, affiliate marketing is all about partnerships and connecting businesses. A network is only really ever as good as the businesses that it helps to develop and to foster through the channel. And so it's also something of a microcosm of digital. That's something that's almost an adage that's been well established within the industry, that affiliate marketing covers all of these different types of digital marketing. And for that reason, we felt that we wanted to use the report as a platform to offer those voices a means of getting their opinions and perspectives across. So that meant including views from across different markets, across different sectors, all manner of different businesses and advertisers. We spoke to trade bodies, regulatory experts, influencer marketing experts, obviously. And in doing so, we really wanted to highlight and celebrate the channel's digital diversity, which became the common theme for the report. So we had over 80 different organizations contribute to the report in the end, and that took the form of very different pieces of content within it. And you'll see that we've got 12 local market Q&As within the report, where we ask a lot of those organizations what's happening within their specific market, and to understand what are the most pressing concerns for them, where they see the largest opportunities in the future for the affiliates, and how it's influencing and interacting with other digital channels within those markets. We also really went out of our way to try and get as many case studies as possible this year to show and demonstrate working examples of how affiliate marketing was being used in each of those markets. So there's one that's attached to each of the local market chapters, but also for a series of sectors as well. So we've got a series of sector chapters based around travel, finance, telecoms, and also fashion and beauty that demonstrate how affiliate marketing is being used for all of those different specific sectors. And we also spoke to a series of thought leaders from across the industry as well to get their views on where affiliate marketing was, and on a series of themes that we felt were particularly important from regardless of which market or which industry you were in. So we spoke to Chris Johnson from Groupon, who is here today somewhere. Chris, hi. And Chris was kind enough to provide us some content with a focus on storytelling, and that being something that was really worth emphasizing in affiliate marketing campaigns. Historically, maybe we've kind of focused more on the numbers and the sales that we've generated, but actually storytelling plays a really pivotal aspect in conveying the value of affiliates, and particularly if we're trying to get buy-in from a more senior level within companies, then that aspect is really of paramount importance. We had Kim, who I'll be speaking to shortly, about influencer marketing and how that's been professionalized over the last few years and been incorporated into the affiliate channel. Gary Keibel, our legal counsel here in the US, who's also here today and I'll be speaking with shortly afterwards. He was kind enough to take part in a regulatory Q&A that tried to understand where we are from a legislative perspective in digital, and particularly what some of the changes that we've been witnessing over the last few years, how they're going to impact affiliate marketing. And there were several other kind of key chapters within there that sought to provide this kind of diversity of opinions. So why is diversity important right now? Well, I mean, I'm sure we've all seen variations on this same kind of infographic or this same graph that I've got from eMarketer here. But it's particularly important now because obviously of the monopolization, arguably, the digital duopoly have taken over the last few years. And with that only change likely to be coming from Amazon, as eMarketer have forecast with their growth of their own advertising platform, we can see just how much it's likely to continue to dominate the actual industry. And as Brent Thiel, an analyst from the financial firm Jefferies, discussed earlier this year in an article that was featured in The Drum, he talked about the fact that actually Amazon's growth is much more likely to come not at the expense of the duopoly at all, but actually smaller players within the industry itself. And we're seeing an increasing amount of consolidation within the ad industry as well, and potentially even the chance of a kind of triopoly is a term that I've been seeing bandied around a lot more now, more recently. So in terms of why that's detrimental, I mean, there's a variety of reasons. We've seen how the likes of Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook have kind of taken a more dominant influence over the digital advertising market right now. And we know that it can reduce competition, and the effects of that can sometimes restrict innovation for the wider industry and empower only a smaller number of players within that market. And brands can feel compelled to obviously concentrate more and more of their spend with these few larger players. And that's a fairly precarious situation for many of them, being beholden to just these few gatekeepers that obviously have such influential control over the ad market. And in the introduction to the report, we kind of discuss and touch upon these things with and cite a few examples of how the likes of Google and Facebook have leveraged their own power within the market itself to sometimes detrimental effects for the wider industry itself and that notion of diversity. And we can see examples of that consolidation as well in the consumer internet. So this was figures taken from a piece of research undertaken by Nokia, their deep field arm a few years back. This was back in 2014, 2015. And they were talking about the fact that in 2007, when they were looking at the amount of traffic that was going online in North America, was coming from a wide range of different individual websites. Thousands of different websites were contributing to that threshold of 50% of that traffic. And just 2 years later, that had dwindled hugely, just 150 different actual websites. And even as more and more people were coming online, that traffic volume was increasing, that threshold was actually dwindling and concentrating even more. In 2014, just 5 years later, that had fallen further to just 35 individual sites that were driving that 50% threshold. And I think I saw something more recently from last year that suggested it was between around about 5 and 10 different websites now. But this obviously is by no means a new, this idea of consolidation is by no means a new phenomenon, particularly from the US's perspective and how regulators in the past have sought to remedy competition within the industries or across industries. So from a legal perspective, this can be traced back to the end of the 19th century in 1890 and the passing of the Sherman Act, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And that act was aimed to prevent the kind of abuse of power that some monopolies might try to leverage within certain industries and prevent competition from functioning within an actual market itself. It was named after Senator John Sherman, a Republican senator at the time, who advocated for the act itself. And he had this famous quote, which I'll read from, where he drew this comparison between the need for equality in markets and essentially the kind of founding principles of America itself and the democracy that it stood for. So he said, if we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of any of the necessities of life. If we would not submit to an emperor, we should not submit to an autocrat of trade with power to prevent competition and to fix the price of any commodity. And I think there's some justification for this analogy around competition and the founding principles of America as well. And I get that obviously for a Brit to come over and start lecturing you on American history, I am aware of the irony, but I just found this stuff really fascinating actually the more I delved into it. And for understandable reasons, this doesn't really feature as part of our curriculum in England. We tend to focus on the victories rather than the losses. But This notion in 1773 of the American colonists obviously throwing chests of tea overboard from the East India Company ships that were docked in Boston at the time was very much a protest that essentially was around competition, unfair taxation. The East India Company were being given an opportunity to import their trades into the nation that the colonists weren't being able to. You might be correcting me if I have any of this history wrong, obviously, but this is what I've read around anyway. So, so that was, it was seen as an unfair abuse of power by the British Crown at the time around notions of competition. And essentially that protest arguably fueled and later kind of culminated, obviously, in the American Revolution. So this notion of fair competition is really central, I think, to the founding of the American nation. And this was a sentiment that really was in mind, I think, when the Sherman Act was brought to bearing, particularly throughout the 20th century. And there were several kind of instances over the course of the last 100 or so years where it's been used to remedy markets where competition was found to be wanting because of one or two companies having that hugely dominant kind of position within a particular industry. Obviously, one of the most famous ones is in 1911, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. And at the time, the origins of the company were that it was more of a refinery business within the oil industry. But through acquisitions and vertical integration throughout that entire supply chain, it started to grow its business beyond just being a refinery to actual oil exploration. It turned more towards the distribution and then the retailing of it directly to customers themselves. And in doing so, it was able to leverage that power that it had throughout the chain to oust competitors and to prevent new entrants from really competing with them. And the Sherman Act was obviously cited and used to try and remedy this power that Standard Oil had, and it culminated in the company being split out into around 30 different smaller factions and organizations from across the country. A later example is obviously another famous one from Microsoft in 2001. And at the time, Netscape, during the browser wars, Netscape had obviously got there first and had a huge market share in terms of its user base. But Microsoft's, the popularity of Windows and particularly the adoption of the PCs, of personal computing for the very first time in that period over the 90s, meant that it was able to leverage its power to bundle in Internet Explorer into that software and to use its contracts with manufacturers in quite an aggressive fashion that meant it was able to oust Netscape's dominance and to ensure that Internet Explorer was the most successful browser at the time. I think around the time the case came around, it was around about a 90% market share that they had. And even though that case didn't actually end with Microsoft being split apart in the same way that Standard Oil had 90 years earlier, the settlement that they came to did act as almost a warning shot to them, and I think they opened the door almost for competitors to come in, new browser developers to be adopted by users from across the world. And over time, though, the regulation and the focus for antitrust law in the US really kind of evolved and changed quite radically. So originally the Sherman Act had focused not just on monopolies, the effects of monopolies in terms of pricing for consumers, but also upon the market structure itself and looking at other factors beyond just pricing and consumer welfare. So things like the rates of innovation within an industry, the barriers to entry for new competitors coming into that market, and also whether or not a dominant power was using its kind of vertical integration to leverage that power and oust other competitors throughout the supply chain. But during the 20th century, antitrust focus narrowed a lot more to just that consumer welfare aspect. And it's particularly interesting, given where we are in Chicago right now, that it was the University of Chicago and the Chicago School, that obviously the School of Economic Thought that came out of that university, that had a really pivotal influence in narrowing that focus for antitrust law. Chief amongst those that had that influence were Richard Posner, who is on the left here, and Robert Bork. I don't know if these are figures that, I wasn't sure actually, I had never heard of them, but whether or not these were people that many people would recognize necessarily here, or that they were figures and names that people would be familiar with. But they suggested that actually antitrust law should focus on if monopoly is leading to price increases, and that would be should be the focus. And the reason for that was suggested that antitrust law was actually slightly paradoxical. In fact, the essay, I think the book that Robert Bork on the right there wrote was called The Antitrust Paradox, which it kind of crystallized this perspective on antitrust law. And he suggested that antitrust was being used to almost artificially sustain businesses that actually weren't competitive and that should really have kind of fallen by the wayside because they were inefficient, and that by sustaining them in this artificial sense, they were able to actually hike up kind of consumer prices, and it damaged consumer welfare. So from their perspective, consolidation could actually be a good thing, and it improved efficiencies within an actual market itself, and therefore for them, antitrust should really only focus on those consumer prices aspects and whether or not that was being hurt by this monopolization. But by focusing on that specific tangible outcome rather than on the market structures and whether or not competition was functioning, they arguably didn't really anticipate how tech giants of the future might look to grow their own businesses. So blitzscaling is the term coined by Reid Hoffman, who's the founder of LinkedIn, and his co-author, Chris Ye, from their book that was published late last year. And again, it's something that we kind of reference in the introduction to the report. And in it, the authors suggest that many of these companies, more recent companies, the likes of Google and Facebook and Amazon, etc., have come to dominate their markets by prioritizing growth over profitability. So that's kind of natural, I think, given that the internet offers unprecedented connectedness to markets right across the globe, and competition can practically come from anywhere. It's not just about your local market and the immediate local environment in terms of where that competition can come from, but you've now got this entire global workplace where competition can arise. And that makes it even more important. It's paramount to scale your business as quickly as possible and to try and dominate your market to prevent that competition from getting a competitive foothold. So to grow rapidly demands that businesses offer customers the best possible service, often at the best possible rates. And that means that consumer welfare aspect isn't necessarily being impinged, which is why regulators arguably haven't been able to focus on it in much the same way as they did historically. Now, Amazon's growth over time is a really illustrative example, I think, of this blitzscaling approach. If you consider the disparity in growth between their revenue and sales and the profits that they've made over time, there's a huge distinct difference, as you can see. I know you can't see that particularly well right there, but quite clearly, sales and revenue are the ones that are spiking up in that fashion, and profits have stayed relatively negligible for them up until quite recently. So profitability has been razor thin for many years, and it's only in recent years, particularly through the kind of ramping up of their advertising platform more recently, that they've started to kind of see more profits derived from their business. And that's kind of been a deliberate strategy from Jeff Bezos. They've prioritized growth over profits to ensure that Amazon has been able to cement its status as a real cornerstone and a part of the infrastructure of the e-commerce industry over the last 20 years. And thanks to taking that long-term view and the long-term view of its investors and backers as well, Bezos has been able to run Amazon at a relative loss for many years and to be able to offer market-leading prices to consumers to ensure that he's growing that user base and prevent competition from getting any kind of foothold in the space. Now, that serves as part of a wider strategy as well, which I think is probably best summed up by this Amazon Flywheel analogy. Again, this is something that you might have seen cited and presented previously, but we can see here, starting off, for instance, with the lower prices that they've been able to offer their customers, how that's improved the customer experience on the marketplace site, how that has then driven traffic to the site, more and more traffic, trying to gain access to the marketplace and the great prices that they offer. In turn, that has incited more and more sellers to offer their goods onto the platform, which again has improved the selection and therefore improved the customer experience. And you can see this kind of virtuous circle or cycle of growth in action here. But meanwhile, the investments that they've been able to make in improving their own infrastructure and improving the efficiency of their marketplace have also seen it extend its business in a similar fashion to Standard Oil, you could argue, in terms of that vertical integration to kind of increase its power within the industry. So it now covers everything from obviously the marketplace itself to Amazon Web Services and the cloud computing businesses that now power so many different e-commerce sites across the world, to the distribution side of things, to the logistics behind that in terms of Amazon's fulfillment facility. And now more recently, we've obviously seen with Amazon Advertising, they've been able to engage advertisers to try and reach customers at an even earlier phase and market to them. And if it were kind of a football analogy, I guess, I'm using that in the North American term rather than the British one, Amazon wouldn't just be the opposition on the pitch, they'd be your teammates as well. They would be the referee within the game. They'd own the stadium, they'd own the franchise, and they'd be running the league itself. And it's because that consumer welfare aspect hasn't necessarily been compromised on that antitrust regulation hasn't necessarily focused in on Amazon's business. That is obviously changing over time, though, and there's been increasing scrutiny and anxiety from journalists over the last few years, and more recently from politicians as well, and it's really captured their attention in the last few years. Elizabeth Warren, the Democrat or candidate for the Democrat presidential elections in 2020, is that right? Next year, yeah. So she has famously made this a kind of central tenet of her manifesto. And speaking at South by Southwest last year, she spoke about this idea that tech companies, these big tech companies, have too much power over the economy and society and democracy, and that they're actually hurting small businesses and stifling that innovation. But this is by no means, obviously, just a kind of Democrat perspective on this. I mean, we've even had President Trump kind of being quoted on Twitter as the same kinds of criticisms that are being targeted at the likes of Amazon around their impact upon society here in the US. And regardless of whether or not you think that government regulation should be kind of taking this kind of proactive stance on big business like this is very much an issue that is on the agenda now. I think yesterday there was even news from, was it the Justice Department, the FTC, I think, are now formalizing their inquiries into Google and Facebook. And there's obviously going to be kind of more and more scrutiny of these businesses over the next couple of years. And some economists are suggesting even that this increasing consolidation that we're seeing within the market is having a negative impact on the economy itself. New startup businesses are in sharp decline. These have traditionally been a huge breeding ground in terms of innovation, new ideas for society, and also job creation itself. And with larger businesses able to outcompete or simply acquire their rivals, we can see that the barriers to entry for new startups and new businesses are arguably larger than ever before. And so it's within that context that affiliate marketing, I think, can offer a really refreshing antidote to this era of creeping consolidation and monopolization. And the channel's always been a great haven for entrepreneurs and innovators and startups. We regularly see new publishers come into the channel to use it as a means of really fueling their venture at a very early stage. We also see smaller advertisers who are able to use that very efficient performance model to connect with new publishers and to really help them market their brand to the wider population as well. And with that kind of in mind, I think that it's that low barrier to entry that, and the constant innovation that we see from these new businesses that offers a powerful way of diversifying ad spend right now. It offers a huge array of partners in terms of the total flexibility on how programs can be set up and incentivized. And it is almost like a veritable, I like to think of it almost as a digital marketing chemistry set, something that you can experiment with endlessly and that is transparent and measurable and provides a tangible kind of outcome from the results that you've been able to pick up. And so the case studies ultimately are really good working examples of this within the report itself, really highlighting that experimentation across sectors and across different business models and across different markets. It might be a German energy supplier, for instance, using its commission models to incentivize particular energy products that they're looking to engage with that local audience, or a Brazilian bus ticketing retailer that is leveraging the popularity of social media in that particular market and Black Friday as well to encourage more travelers out there to buy their tickets online. Or even an established beauty brand in France, Dr. Pierre Ricot, were one of the case studies that we featured. And they had a demographic that was fairly well established, which was focused on a slightly older female clientele. And they wanted to understand how they could target slightly younger audience and the next generation of beauty consumers. And they used the affiliate channel to connect with influencers out in the French region, which really helped them to kind of successfully engage precisely that type of audience. So affiliate marketing is being shaped and molded in all of these different examples to help connect businesses directly with consumers right across the web in a manner that really benefits all parties. So that's kind of a taste of what the report itself is going to will focus on. So I hope that that's obviously kind of whetted your appetite slightly for it. But like I said, it is a chunky piece of work, and if you did want to get the digital interactive version, then you can find that here today on the Awin site. Thank you. I don't know if you've got any questions for me, but if you do, then by all means, take a copy, Simon. But yeah, if you've got any questions for me, then please do feel free to ask, or later afterwards when we've got the networking lunches afterwards. We've got 3 interviews that I'd be quite keen to kind of get into now and to give those guys time to really get involved in the subjects that they discussed. So if I can invite Thijs van Santen from Button. Hey, Thijs. Thanks for coming. So Thijs was Chief Revenue Officer from Button, right? Yeah. And Button were kind enough, still am, yeah.
Last time I checked.
That's not what I heard. But Button were kind enough to contribute to the American chapter for the Awin report. And so I guess I kind of wanted to start off by asking you a little bit about Button for those people that aren't familiar with what you guys do and how you function.
Yeah, cool. First of all, thanks for having me here. Thanks everyone else for staying in the room and not running out when hearing my name. So Button is a mobile commerce platform. We effectively help brands engage with consumers across a whole ecosystem of mobile apps and web properties. We help publishers create much more relevant experiences for consumers and help them get to the destination where they want to get to at the right time. And then ultimately, we help consumers give them a better buying experience on mobile. And what's really interesting is what's really been driving this for us is like it kind of was touched on in your presentation as well. If you look in the mobile ecosystem, like everything looks different. Right, so if you think about like Google and Facebook, they're commanding about 60% of the spend, and as a result, brands are facing an increasing cost to both engage and acquire new users. If you look at the cost of an impression of Facebook last year rose with 122%. It's pretty insane. So there's a lot of challenges that brands and publishers are facing in creating more enticing experiences. So that's what we're trying to solve for.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that obviously the year of mobile was something that was vaunted for many years and it became almost like an annual running joke, really, that this is going to be the year of mobile. I think we can firmly say now that we are in the mobile era. But how do you think that has really transformed and changed consumer habits, that adoption of mobile from their perspective?
Sure. So I think that it's no secret to anyone that we spend a lot of time on our mobile phones. In fact, in 2018, on average, we spent twice as much time on our mobile phones as we did on desktop. Yet commerce and purchasing behavior has stayed behind, and that's because it's been very difficult to create enticing experiences for consumers and actually make it easy for them to buy, as well as like instill the trust that you want to have with the consumer to effectively buy on your platform. Yep, we're seeing that change, right? So last year, this global discretionary spend grew with about 7%. E-commerce grew with 15%, yet mobile commerce grew with 40%. So you see that, there's a real trend going on there, which is fueled with, changing demographics, of course, the evolution of the ecosystem, apps, more attention on apps and websites, as well as the adoption of mobile wallets, which I think is going to be a massive driver for users to become more used to buying, with their mobile devices. What's interesting is, for those of you that are from London, it's very common for you to pay for the tube, which we call the subway in New York, with your mobile phone. And for those of you that are in New York, you probably start seeing that that's being rolled out there as well. So we're getting increasingly used to using our mobile device as a payment method, and with that, it's becoming more of a buying environment. The other interesting thing is, if you look at, and I have to peek here, Amazon, Walmart, eBay, and Target, of all the time that was spent on mobile, between 77 and 85% was actually spent in app. So again, if you look across those 4 brands, 77 to 85% of the time that consumers spend on their properties is on an app versus web. So there's increasing focus on getting your customers to become an app user, because app users are much more loyal users. And the way to think about this is like the prime position you want to be as an app is on that first page. It's almost like the Google results. If you're not on the first page, then your relevance drops significantly. So you see that a lot of brands are waking up to the fact that in order to build sustainable, profitable relationships with consumers, they need to do that, through a whole host of channels. I'm not saying that desktop and offline are not relevant. In fact, they are very relevant. Yet mobile is a key entry point, because it's a device that you always have with you. It's very personal. So there's a strong indicator there. Let me see. I wrote a few other things down. Then the last thing that I think is worth mentioning is that MWeb remains an important channel as well, and it's particularly to still capture search traffic, right? So although users, typically in the desktop world, intent started with Google, right? So you would go onto your computer and you would look for something, and that would take you somewhere. Today, that doesn't happen anymore. So consumers are increasingly going directly to an app, and where they have a purpose. So whether it's a TripAdvisor app, to look for a good deal on a hotel, or to kayak to look for a flight, and so forth and so forth. But if the app is not there, then consumers still use search. And search typically leads to, actually almost always leads to MWeb properties. Google does not like to send the user away into an app. And so MWeb properties are key to convert a user from an MWeb user to an app user. And so, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that kind of concept of mobile commerce is something that's really central, isn't it, to the kind of Button's own publication.
Yes.
More recently, you've just published a new white paper, I believe. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of real central.
I'd like to call it a report.
Yeah.
So we talk about building a commerce strategy to publishers, and we talk to brands about really leveraging commerce versus advertising to engage and acquire new users. Now, I'm speaking to an audience that is obviously very familiar with this, right? So affiliate has really been built on the premise of remunerating the source of traffic when a transaction has completed. And so from that perspective, it's really not that new. What we're seeing in mobile is that a lot of the traditional publishers are still stuck with that old way of thinking, and thinking about display impressions and ads, which are effectively not working, right? So I think there's a question later about tracking, but obviously there are tracking issues. There's tons of fraud issues that are, they're not just fake impressions, but it's even attribution fraud. There's just a ton of issues that advertisers and publishers run into, and more importantly for publishers, typically ads are just annoying, right? So there is very limited real estate that you have on the screen. And more often than not, you just don't want to see that ad, or you don't want to see that video. And because everybody is all about viewability and like making sure that you see it, they'll make sure you see it. As in, just look for that button to kind of like where's that X where I can get rid of this with this ad. And as a result, users spend less time on those publisher properties. So it's kind of like a downward spiral. So what Button believes is that if you build a commerce strategy, which is much more aligning, your actions or the buttons, right? Guess where the name came from. With the intent of the user, is you can create a much more relevant experience, which ultimately benefits both the publisher and the brand, right? So good examples are, we work with Foursquare. Foursquare is one of our publishers, and typically people go into Foursquare to look at, like, how do I go somewhere? They look for a review for a restaurant, and so forth, and so forth. So if you look at a restaurant, it's likely that you want to go there or you want to eat, right? So that's one. And then you may want to get food from that restaurant. So we serve, a caviar button or a Postmates button. But we also serve an open table button because you might actually want to, book a table there and, make sure that you get to eat that night. And then if you're not, not too close by, we serve an Uber or Lyft button to take you there. So in other words, you could see those buttons as ads, but they're not, right? So they're highly relevant, they're contextual, and they're enhancing the experience for the user. And as a result, what happens is that the utility of Foursquare, and the relevance actually grows, right? So they see more engagement and usage within their app. And at the same time, Uber sees more bookings, OpenTable sees more bookings. Caviar, has the ability to, both engage with new users as well as existing users. So, and everybody wins.
Yeah, I mean, you guys have been involved in the affiliate channel for some time now, and I wonder, kind of from a mobile marketing perspective, what you see as the future being from an affiliate perspective in terms of those partnerships.
Yeah, so that, and I definitely wrote a few things down there. I think that there's a lot happening. Right, so one thing, the big elephant in the room obviously is Amazon, right? So Amazon's associates program is, a beast that is just phenomenal what they've done. There are suggestions that 25% of Amazon's retail sales are actually driven through their associates program, which is pretty insane. And one thing that Amazon has done very well is they've really fostered deep partnerships and relationships with content partners. Right, something that every self-respecting brand wants, right? So they want to see more traffic from content and discovery sites, and that's something that that Amazon has done very well. At the same time, though, a lot of the content is found through Google, and Google is also somebody who has a lot of power and a lot of self-interest, and so. I don't know if you've noticed this, but if you do product searches, often Google is extracting, reviews from those third-party review sites on the top of the results page, and then offers product links, and those product links then go to a Google store, and so they steal traffic that way, very cleverly. So what Amazon has started doing is they actually started to bring content on their own property, right? So they start doing deals with big content providers where they actually publish the content itself on Amazon, and Amazon therefore is really seeking to become that starting point for any commerce journey online. And I think that's a trend, and that's a danger for a lot of advertisers or brands. And I would say that over time it becomes also a really risky business for publishers because you can have a lot of eggs in one basket. Yeah. So that's one. I think the other one, and this is already happening, but I see the rise of strategic partnerships. And what I mean with that is, in the ecosystem, you have like what I would call pure play publishers. So those are properties that are designed to attract traffic, either by creating content or, publishing offers and deals. But their business model is just purely created to monetize the traffic, in some sort of way. But beyond that, we're seeing more and more that there are opportunities for organizations to partner where the core purpose of the one property is not necessarily monetizing traffic, but where there are opportunities to offer the visitor with a path to a third-party property that's highly relevant and non-competitive. So as an example, we work with Hotels.com, And so we work with Hotels.com both as an acquisition channel, so they identify, engage, and acquire users through our ecosystem. But we also run them as a publisher. And so Hotels.com has a concierge service. So when you've made a booking through Hotels.com, then afterwards people leave, right? And hotels doesn't like that, right? They want to keep engaging with the user and they want to keep it relevant. So the hotel's concierge service is once you've made the booking, they basically start suggesting relevant ideas and services that are related to your booking. So for instance, we serve Ticketmaster buttons with like relevant shows at the destination where you want to go to. If it's near the time of your booking, we will again serve an Uber button. It's probably no secret that we work with Uber. We serve open table bookings and so forth and so forth. And so that concept is not limited to mobile. You can see this in desktop as well. Mm-hmm. So I do believe that more brands, advertisers will seek for additional partnership opportunities beyond the traditional ecosystem, and they want to do that on a CPA basis because it makes sense for both parties, and it's basically non-conflicting. Mm. And then the last one, and I think this is more of a mobile example as well, and it's one that we've certainly been following with keen interest, and that is the whole, the off-property experience versus on-property experience. So let me give you an example. So obviously, with Instagram, now offering on-property checkout and effectively, trying to create its own commerce experience within in its app, there's a pretty aggressive move to keep the user within its own environment, and others are doing that as well. So we've seen this with a good example is Yelp with Grubhub, right? So where now through Yelp you no longer have to leave the property at all, and you can actually, when you look at the restaurant, you can actually basically order a takeout without ever opening the Grubhub app or even going to their MWeb. And even in our own industry, there's an example with Honey trying to do this, right? So if you look at Honey's latest app, they're actually, creating a whole checkout experience, within their own app versus, bringing it to the brand. Now, I am of the belief that those strategies are challenged. I think that Instagram obviously has the power and the skill to force, a lot of their brands to follow suit. And you see that it's particularly the micro brands that will do this. I believe that the big brands are not going to tolerate it because they will want to build those own relationships. They will want to have their own apps on their phones, and they want to have those direct partnerships. But it's certainly a trend to look for. So it's kind of like the upside down, or the alternative version of what Amazon is trying to do is bringing the content on its own properties.
Talking of future trends, I guess from the West perspective, a lot of the time we're often looking at China as far as being kind of a beacon for mobile experiences and the massive adoption of mobile there. I think last year, Singles Day, something like around 90% of sales occurred on mobile platforms. So,
and $21 billion in sale on a single day.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. But where do you think, I guess, why do you think there's that lag between the West and China at the moment? And how do you see other global markets? Do you see them adopting those the same kind of tactics that we've seen in China at the moment?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that in China, it's kind of like they leapfrogged the PC or the desktop area to a large extent, right? I'm not saying that PCs weren't used in China and all of a sudden everybody had a mobile phone, not at all. But if you look at desktop penetration rates, in China versus the West, they were a lot lower. And by the time mobile phones were coming around, it was a lot easier for people to get those. So first of all, mobile phone and smartphone adoption in China is super high. And then if you look at the kind of the Chinese version of Facebook, Tencent, they have a very different business model. So they really have a partnership model where if you look at Tencent's revenue, I think 93% of their revenue is coming from partnerships and non-advertising activities. So only 7% of their actually it's 87 and 13%. Whereas Facebook is getting 93% of its revenue from advertising. So it's a whole different model. Now, if you look at WeChat, it's kind of like a starting point for pretty much any journey. So consumers are very used to starting in WeChat and quite frankly also finishing within WeChat. So it's a very action-oriented model, and where everything is designed around making it seamless and relevant, without disrupting the user with annoying ads and videos that they don't want to see.
Yeah.
And then lastly, the other thing, as is kind of I referenced before, the adoption of mobile wallets and mobile payment platforms is much higher there.
Yeah.
So you see users being very used to using their mobile device as a payment platform, and with that, it becomes a lot easier to transact on mobile.
Sure.
Now, in terms of other markets, obviously India is another massive market where you see that the adoption of traditional electronic payments platforms is not rampant like we have here, right? So most people still transact in cash. So a lot of people don't even have bank accounts. So there's going to be a leapfrog there as well. This is where people, will basically move into kind of like new fintech and based models, which are all going to be mobile based. So I believe that we will start seeing similar trends there, and where it's really kind of going to be mobile first economies.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to quickly ask actually if there's any other pressing questions that any members from the audience have got or they'd like to put to Thijs around mobile and the affiliate channel tool. I mean, I have plenty of questions here, so we can always press on. Yeah? Thanks, Sam.
So what about watches? What's your view on connected watches and some really small devices like that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that the watch is a utility, and it is typically an extension of the phone. Now, obviously, with the latest release of Apple, they're trying to distance themselves a little bit from that. So I do believe that there's going to be some functionality, typically for purchases that don't require a lot of thinking. And what I mean with that is, for instance, when you go onto the subway, right? So where it's just really transactional. There's no super low consideration purchases, where you are already a known entity to the seller, and where you have set that up. I personally don't believe that the watch will have any discovery kind of functionality, and where there is any consideration requirement for the user before they want to buy, it's going to play any role, unless we see a trend where it becomes extremely fashionable to wear a 15-inch watch on your wrist, and that becomes your primary device. Yeah.
One of the reasons I think that Amazon has a lot of success with being the go-to point of purchase for consumers is because people know their login for Amazon, the username and password. And I think it's a real point of friction for people to log into multiple sites. I personally use a third-party password tool. I think everybody should. We should all use unique passwords for every site we log into that are auto-generated. But this concept seems to be foreign to most people, and the browser's built-in tools seem to come up a little short. That challenge as a point of friction seems to be even stronger with the mobile space, because it's a little easier to type things out on the desktop. What are your thoughts around that in the future in reducing that friction?
Yeah, so on Amazon, I think you're the logged in status and knowing the user, it absolutely plays a role. I would argue that the trust that Amazon has managed to build with its consumers is quite frankly the number one reason why people buy so much from them, right? So even when I'm at home, I use my mobile device to buy things from Amazon because it's typically like an impulse buy, but it's also because I know that if I don't like it or if I change my mind, I can return it and they're never going to give me any shit whatsoever. So I think that the trust component there is very important. Now, with respect to the login status, I think this is really where the apps come in. Right, so an app, typically, if you're a regular user of an app, you're logged in, and it becomes more and more important because the mobile device is such a personal device. Personalization, right, it's been talked about a lot, but it's also very important. So it doesn't matter whether you're a content publisher or a retailer or an airline. You want to create more and more, personalized experiences, and the app is a prime vehicle for that. And the login status, and obviously being logged into the app, is going to be a requirement for that. The other interesting thing that I don't know if anyone has noticed, but WWDC, but Apple announced that it's actually introducing its own kind of login service. So, obviously Google and Facebook have capitalized on their position and creating all these like very convenient login services where you can sign up with Google and sign up with Facebook, which basically allows them to track you everywhere and nowhere. And create those personalized experiences. I think Apple is going to fight that in a similar way, but do that with much more privacy in mind. And I think that's also going to create an opportunity for both publishers and brands to kind of tackle that challenge that you just highlighted.
I guess that's all part of Apple's own strategy at the moment, which is kind of shifting from more of a product-led business to one that's more maybe services-led.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I'm not a shareholder, but if I look at all the big tech companies out there, Apple is the only one that I would trust my data with. I feel that they're the only company that truly cares about privacy and that's really making concerted efforts to give you control over what happens with your data.
Do we have time for one more question? Yeah. Anyone else at all? Because I've got one that segues quite nicely from that, if that's okay. So mobile tracking is obviously of fundamental importance at the moment, and Apple's ITP updates, with them coming into force, do you see in-app activity and kind of customer retention that's becoming more and more important, surely, through the kind of primacy that's being given to first-party data?
Yeah, so for those of you, ITP 2.2, right, which is the latest update, effectively means that Apple will no longer tolerate first-party cookies for more than 24 hours. So, for all those folks that have updated their tracking from gateway to first-party, that effort helped you a bit, but not enough. This obviously applies to both desktop Safari as well as MWeb. Tracking, that is a major challenge, right? So, and to your point, I think it's mainly fueled through, advertising ecosystems and models and, retargeting and other privacy concerns that people have. We believe that, you can't get around, tracking, right? So there has to be a way to effectively do that. So that's why we use tokens, which are all server-side. They don't require any cookies, and so forth and so forth. And we focus more on creating experiences that rely less on third-party platforms. So all the publishers that we work with, when a user engages with content that's powered by Button, it actually doesn't kick out into Safari. It actually uses an embedded web browser, which keeps that user within the publishing environment, even if it's looking at a third-party property. And with that, we give more control, to both the publisher and the user in terms of, what's being tracked. And that also allows us to create more personalized experiences. I do believe that tracking will remain a main target, particularly for Apple and, for regulators. I think we can all agree that Gdpr actually has failed miserably because it actually only has helped Google and Facebook, and it's really put a lot of the smaller players at a disadvantage. So we will continue to see an evolution there. I'm trying to think if there's anything else quasi-intelligent I can say about this, but there's nothing I can think of right now.
Well, if the audience want to find out more, obviously, about Button's latest kind of content you've been producing around this idea of mobile commerce and where it's heading at the moment, where can they go to?
Yeah, don't go to button.com. That domain is a little bit too expensive for us. So go to usebutton.com. Or hit up Dennis, Amanda, who are in the room here as well. And I think that Andrew's here, and I should be around for a little bit as well.
Great. Well, thank you
Good
for that,
stuff.
Thijs.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Cheers. I wanted to invite Kim Westwood from Shopping Links up, who also provided us with a great contribution to the Awin report this year. So do you want to start off, actually, Kim, just by explaining who Shopping Links are?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, so to give you a bit of background on Shopping Links, I started the business 5 years ago now, a little over 5 years ago, when influencers wasn't even really a term. So if you look at the search history over a number of years, it was really just emerging at that time. And I had a love of fashion, a love of social media, and really felt that influencers were a way that marketers were able to promote products. So that's sort of how we really started, and at the time it was all based on vanity metrics, so it was all based on reach. There was no conversion. it was actually Rakuten, the network, who said, Kim, we really like this idea of, connecting bloggers with brands. Can you offer commission as a benefit type? And I was like, oh, okay. We were just gifting product. So it was basically a gifting platform that you could connect with the influencer. You could gift them some product. And in those days, in Instagram, you couldn't even tag a brand. You could literally just give them some product and ask them if they could, comment at the bottom. There was no algorithm, there was no DMs. And so it's sort of like, okay, I don't mind offering commission as a benefit type. And so we did. We offered commission as a benefit type, and we really found that there was no sales. And we were like, whoa, okay, we're driving traffic, but we're not getting the conversion in terms of the sales. And it was really telling to us after a period of time of working with the brands via the network, and one brand out of the US, they really said, we want to start paying bloggers. Can you offer, via your platform? We were tracking, obviously, the conversion via all the different networks. They said, can we offer flat fee payments? And I was like, oh, okay, why do you want to offer them flat fee payments? And they were seeing a lot of data that we weren't able to see around new customer acquisition. So they were seeing 97% new customer acquisition from the influencer channel. And I think still today, it's, I guess, a vision of mine is how do we work more closely together to start tracking that as a network, because that is, is huge. And so they were obviously then wanting to offer flat fee payments. But yeah, so in the early days, it was just really vanity metrics. There was no data coming from Instagram. There was no ability to see the type of audience that the influencer had. And we're just tracking the traffic, really.
Yeah, and your article essentially does kind of chart the professionalization of the influencer channel and how, I guess, affiliate marketing and the adoption of influencers within that channel has kind of helped to contribute, I guess, to that professionalization.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important point, because I think the affiliate networks have really helped to drive an understanding of the performance of the channel. So we've had, and we still do have, huge amounts of budget being spent with digital parts of the business, PR parts of the business, social parts of the business, content parts of the business, with no performance tracking. And where we've seen really good success with brands that we've worked with over a number of years is when all parts of those businesses work more closely together. So if we can get, some sort of affiliate tracking on a PR activity around gifting influencers, then we've been able to see, well, which influencers are then performing and which ones aren't. And that's really important for a brand to be able to see that. It is about conversion. I appreciate that there's branding activity as well around reach and impressions, but I think the professionalisation has really come from how we're able to track that performance and how we can continue to track that performance.
Yeah. The last click model, obviously, that is so inherent to the channel, that's been quite an obstacle, obviously, for these publishers that have come in and whose activity is naturally that much further up the kind of general research funnel as far as e-commerce is concerned. So, I mean, how do you see affiliate kind of evolving to help, I guess, incentivize properly those influencers?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because we still see influencers driving a lot of that new customer acquisition, first click. I haven't, across all the networks, I haven't had any experience with attribution working. So that for me would be like, a really key piece is how do we get attribution really embedded for every advertiser, for every sub-network. How can we really start to reward those influencers in a different way than just flat fee payments. Obviously we've migrated to flat fees because we haven't been able to really put some good measures around, that sort of first click, middle click, last click conversion. But I think that that's one thing that we collectively need to do more on. Is how do we start to look at attribution throughout the channel, and throughout the influencer, driving different customers and
So if for advertisers that maybe haven't kind of dabbled in influencer marketing before, and particularly through their kind of affiliate programs, I mean, what kind of advice or recommendations would you necessarily have for them in terms of kind of reaching out, engaging, setting up their program to ensure that they are providing the right kinds of incentives that they can engage with them properly?
Yeah, I think with influencer, it's not affiliate, and I think that, you know, I'm the first one to say it's the most closely aligned, and we need to be, you know, really working together more on how influencer intersects affiliate. I think for advertisers, often we see that they're really wanting that ROI, they're really wanting the last click traffic, and influencer just doesn't generally provide that. But what we have learnt over the years is there are a number of strategies from the affiliate channel that you can apply to influencer to get a greater level of conversion. So we would always start with, you know, what is the objective? You know, is it content? Is it SEO? Is it more traffic? Is it more sales? If it is sales and you are wanting to drive traffic and sales as via content, or via influencer, we would really say, you know, start to apply some of the strategies that work with affiliates. So we've seen, for example, when we work with an influencer, the influencer promotes the brand, they may not drive any, you know, great sales. As soon as we offer a conversion incentive, such as a discount code, free shipping, some sort of incentive for the influencer's audience to convert, then we see a huge uplift in sales and traffic. So we would say think about some of those strategies and applying some of those things. I think also working more collectively across the marketing function within your business. So again, we see brands who are just looking for the traffic and sales, but they're not necessarily looking at how they can repurpose the influencer imagery. So L2 here in the States did some research on the number of brands who were using influencer and those who were actually repurposing the content. And they found that 10% of brands were repurposing the content. And we know when we've studied brands and the brands that we work with that they can get a 33% increase in click-through rate, a 22% increase in sales when they use that influencer imagery via an EDM or a CRM newsletter. In some cases, 59% uplift on site sales if they're using the influencer imagery. So really looking across the business as opposed to just looking at the affiliate conversion, but working together with PR, working together with digital, and starting to say, okay, we've had a gifting campaign across a PR activity. How can we get that affiliate team to then start to be tracking the performance of those influencers rather than just gifting product and not knowing, you know, who is performing and who's not performing?
Yeah. Do we have any questions at all from the audience around influencer marketing? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rena. I have a blog with my sister here in town.
Yeah.
My question is, and I'm trying to figure out how to structure it, is where do you see affiliate, like influencer affiliate marketing going in terms of Facebook and Pinterest and blogs? I feel like lately there's just so much fixation with Instagram, and maybe it's just my experience, but I think Instagram right now, until what Shri has shown us happens, is less actionable. Sometimes, you know, whereas with Facebook that you can do a shop, you can tell more of a like elaborate story, you can have multiple links in your post, and then blog posts, of course, being the most elaborate. Where do you see brands and affiliate marketing taking those platforms, or how do they use those? Where are those headed?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and we've been keeping obviously our finger on the pulse as to what's happening with the Instagram changes. I think that, you know, social platforms will come and go. You know, we've seen YouTube, we've seen, you know, increase in YouTube bloggers, we've seen, you know, now Instagram doing the shoppable posts. You know, obviously what we see is that the swipe up drives a lot of conversion. So for us, it's how we work more closely with the affiliate networks to track that. Now, we've got some challenges around that, such as the session tracking. So obviously when we look at those monopolies and we look at things like Instagram, who they drop the cookie off. My view is how do we work more closely with tracking technology? How do we really start to tap into some useful parameters around that, whether it be, cookieless tracking. We found with one brand, for example, we always find the swipe up works really well for brands, and particularly if the influencer has high impressions and good reach. But one brand we were working with, we decided that we would do the swipe up, we'd track it via the pixel, but we would also look at offering the cookieless tracking in terms of a coupon code. And we found that in the session, 38 orders were placed, but there was 118 orders placed over the course of the next week. And that's something that, we're sort of like, okay, well, how can we work more closely with the networks to get the technology better, such that we can start to put some of those things in place as process for advertisers, rather than, I think that influencers, they don't get a fair deal because we've got session-based tracking, we've got last-click tracking, so I think that we've got to work more closely with the networks around that.
I think there's there's a case study actually in the report which features HP, and I think part of it is around their use of the kind of cookieless tracking coupon tool that we've now got that was really effective, I think, in engaging with kind of unusual social platforms like Reddit, for instance, and trying to kind of engage with audiences there, which was is definitely worth checking out in that regard.
Yeah, and I think it's about education too. So how do we, educate advertisers? How do we work more closely on those pieces around what is available within the network? How can we make that standard for advertisers, to utilise some of that technology?
Any other questions at all from the audience for now around influencers? No? Well, I guess the flip side of my flip side to the question that I asked previously from an advertiser perspective, what advice, I guess, do you have for bloggers or influencers, or for those who are getting involved in the channel for the first time? And I guess what kind of mindset do they have to have in terms of connecting with brands through the channel?
Yeah. I think with influencers, I think there's still a level of, professionalisation that we can still work towards. We find that, the perfect, conversion piece comes when an influencer has the right audience, and the audience fit is really good with the target customer base. And I think we've sort of, we've had this wild west of, influencers can ask whatever they like. There's no measurement of performance. It's all reach-based, or it was even just follower-based, so it was open to fraud and, and fraudulent activity, which has happened. And you've seen bot farms, and you've seen all those sorts of things. I think for an influencer, it's about how do they build the relationships. And I think that the influencer channel, we have to be reminded, is all about relationships. That they are people. They're not a display ad. So I think it's really looking at, working more closely with them, give them some product, and I think for the influencer, it's about receiving that product and testing that product with the audience, as opposed to saying, okay, it's $5,000 a post, and I'm not even going to try that particular product. So I think it's being open around that as well, and there's more and more data that's coming, to the forefront around type of audience, reach, cities, all that level of data is really important, and I think the influencer, has a duty to make sure that that's available to the brand before they take on a job, essentially.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Kim. And if anybody... Oh, we do have one question at the back, actually. I think we can fit in.
A pretty loud voice. Yeah, I just had a question. Obviously, you're working internationally. I was wondering if there's any difference in terms of behavior for influencers in, say, China or Australia or UK or US. What are the differences between market, specifically in China, where the influencer business, the KOL business, is such a big one? In terms of expectation, what they expect, what key results look like?
Yeah, really good question. So we do work across international markets, predominantly the US, the UK, Europe and Australia. But we have done some campaigns with KOLs out of China. It's a hard market, the China market, especially for influencers. So the behaviour is very different in terms of, how they're driving that sort of traffic and conversion. In Australia, we've been really lucky to spend a lot of time with the government. So the government has really, they do a lot of work in the China market. So I met with a number of influencers, just to talk about how they convert and things like that. Their market is very different in terms of, obviously they transact a lot on the platforms, so those sorts of big businesses have their own influencers and they almost grow them, so they promote them within the platform, and they then obviously give them product and get them to convert. Where we've spoken to, say, Australian brands who have been really effective using influencers in China, they've really just been using it as a branding activity as opposed to a conversion activity. So they will be driving more awareness about where to buy those products as opposed to actually tracking the conversion. So it's a very different market. But across Australia, the US, the UK and Europe, very similar in terms of the way that influencers promote. We find in the Australian market there's really good conversion in terms of traffic and sales, and I think there's fewer influencers, and I think there's this understanding now that the audience wants the influencer to be rewarded for actually purchasing from them. So when we find tracking not working, for example, and the influencer says, my affiliate link is not working for this, the audience gets quite upset that the affiliate link is not working because they're buying from the influencer, they've got that loyal relationship with them, and they feel that the influencer is then not being remunerated, and that then falls back on them. So it's really quite interesting. I think the US market, there's a lot of influencers, so we have 40% of our network from the US. I think it's really telling to find, and we've got some more work on this as well, around interest level. So if we've used an influencer, so the data stacks up, they've got the right audience, the right age range, the right regions, the right gender, and we've said, okay, let's promote sweaters or something like that. And it's tanked, and we're like, whoa, what happened? Like, all the data was really good, the numbers were good, like we would have predicted that would have been, a good campaign. And it's come back in many instances to the interest. So the interest, why does that follower come to see that blogger? And it might be relationships, so it's not about fashion. So that's been really telling as well. How do we pull some of that data in about, what is the interest level of the audience, and how we can tap into that a little bit more. But very similar for the other markets.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Kim. And if people want to find out more about your article, obviously that's in the report.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Cheers. And finally, Gary Keibel is going to join us here to talk about regulation with specific focus on CCPA.
Right.
How are you? Okay.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to introduce yourself first of all, Gary, just to give some
Sure.
context.
My name is Gary Keibel, and I'm a lawyer with a firm in New York, Davis & Gilbert, and I do a lot of work in the advertising, digital, and privacy industries. And so I'm very glad that you had me here. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks for coming along. So for those of us that aren't necessarily up to date entirely, because it seems to be constantly changing as far as the California Consumer Privacy Act is concerned, can you just give us a quick summary of it, what it's going to entail when it comes into force next year, and just what the latest amendments might have been?
Sure. So many of you may have heard that there's this new law coming into effect called the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. And it's a big deal in the United States because we've never had a comprehensive privacy law on the federal or state level that applies to all activities regarding personal information. We've had laws that target different sectors, children's information or financial information or health information, but there's never been this comprehensive law that covers everything. And some people have compared it to GDPR, and there are similarities. But the key thing about the California law is that it applies to all personal information, and it gives consumers a right to access their personal information so they can contact you and ask you to delete it, update it, give them a copy of their data. And it also requires you to give a consumer the right to opt out of certain transfers of that data. Now, as we sit here today, those rights don't exist. The law takes effect in 2020. Right now, if a consumer reached out to your company and said, I want to know what personal information you have about me, unless you had said something in your privacy policy that gave the consumer that right, you'd have the right to say, I'm not going to give you that information. Or if they reached out to you and said, I want you to delete everything you know about me, you'd have a right now to say, I'm not going to do that. I want to keep that data. But this law is going to change all of that. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is this is an opt-out law, unless you're dealing with children. But it's an opt-out law. So this does not require you to get opt-in consent from every consumer in order to process their personal information. But once you do get their information, you now have certain obligations under the law to allow consumers to access it. And then if you transfer it to other parties, under the law it's called a sale. And you intuitively think, well, I don't sell personal information. But the law defines sale extremely broadly. If you have a Google Analytics tag on your site, you might be deemed to be selling personal information to Google because you're collecting tracking cookies and unique identifiers, and it's going to Google, even though technically it's going directly to them. Under the law, that might be a sale. So there are going to be a lot of new obligations that are going to be imposed on U.S. companies that they've never had to deal with before.
This is a state-level piece of legislation with specific kind of remit for California citizens, though. And so do you think that this is something that other state legislators are going to be looking at with a view to kind of enacting their own legislation, and perhaps even the government from a federal level as well?
Sure. So yes, this is a state law. It is a California state law, and it applies to California residents. Now, if you do business online, it's kind of hard to avoid California, right? I mean, it's like the seventh largest economy in the world independently. And from the clients I speak to, I'm not coming across any clients who say that they're going to treat a California person different than someone from Oregon. So they're going to put in place compliance procedures, and next year, if that California resident or the Oregon resident contacts them, they're going to give them the same rights. It's almost more complicated to have different rights for people in different states. And to your point about what's happening elsewhere, other states are getting on the bandwagon here. There are many other states that are passing and considering laws about this transparency and consumer access rights. Actually, Nevada just passed a law which takes effect before 2020, before Ccpa, although it's a little narrower. And New York is working on a law as well. So you're going to see these popping up all over the place, and it's going to be hard to ignore them. Now, on the federal level, will the federal government come in and wipe out all these crazy state laws and put in one federal law? I don't know. Industry would love that, but our Congress is sometimes a little bit inept and can't get things done. So while there's a lot of talk about that, I don't suspect that's going to happen soon.
I mean, these issues are obviously hugely pertinent right now, right across the world, not just obviously in America. And we've obviously had GDPR in Europe over the last kind of couple of years. But do you think that these localized regulation, I guess I mean that from a nationwide or continental perspective, it runs the risk of hindering the success and growth of online businesses that obviously are profoundly borderless in a way. They're interacting with consumers right across the globe. So do you think that that's going to be an issue? I've heard kind of the use of the word of this kind of balkanization of the internet, and that regulation like this does potentially kind of run the risk of displacing and fragmenting the global e-commerce industry.
Yeah, I would say it's bad for everybody except for one group of people, privacy lawyers. It's kind of the Full Employment Act for us. But it is very complex for everyone else. How do you deal with different standards all over, of course, the world, and then even in different states? So you have to go to the strictest standard that you can find in your jurisdiction. And we deal with this in other industries. I deal with clients that are doing global sweepstakes. And you've got different sweepstakes laws in different countries, and they vary. And if you're doing a global promotion, you have to go in these different countries and make sure that you comply. The hope is that a lot of these standards will be similar. Like I said, CCPA is similar to GDPR in some respects, but it's different in other respects. So it's making the compliance efforts much more challenging, which is why there is a push to try to get a federal privacy law that would preempt California, preempt the other states. But I think politically, it's probably unlikely. California is really latching on to their law. The Speaker of the House is from California, and she said she's not going to allow something that will preempt California. The two senators from California in the Senate said they were not going to allow preemption there. So I think it's very likely California is going to happen. Something will happen on the federal level, but I don't think it's going to get rid of the California obligation.
You mentioned actually just in reference to GDPR and the differences there, what are the primary differences between the two forms of legislation?
So under GDPR, there's a lot of differences, but I'll just give you a few examples. Yeah. So under GDPR, you need to have a legal basis to process personal information of an individual. It could be you got consent. It could be you have what's called a legitimate interest. It could be that you have to process the data to perform a contract, but you need to basically justify your right to process personal information. Again, California is an opt-out law. You don't have to justify the reason you have the personal information. You do have to make sure you didn't steal it or get it under false pretenses, but you're allowed to collect personal information. You don't have to justify the reason. GDPR also focuses a lot on internal data security at a company, whereas CCPA, the California law, is really focused on the consumer and giving rights to the consumer.
Okay. Do we have any questions at all from the audience around this? Yeah, we've got one just at the back there. So.
Hi, thank you. Do you see a mechanism being put in place akin to like can spam? So a lot of us that deal with email use varying databases to make it really easy for people to opt out, and we can track it, and we have their IP and all of that. So if we ever get into an issue, we can report back that we did take that action and when it was taken and all of that. So do you see this process in California and potentially beyond being simplified by a mechanism similar to that?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and a thing that a lot of the people in the industry are asking about. It's that, like, I'm a small publisher, I'm a small affiliate, how am I supposed to process all of this? There are some things that are happening. I think unfortunately, the EU cookie banners that you've all seen, I think those might come to the US because you're going to need to make more disclosures to individuals about what third parties are on your site. You go to the typical site, you run a ghostery search on it, you might find 30, 40, 50 tags on there. There's got to be more transparency about that. And there are moves by some industry associations to come up with a consolidated opt-out mechanism. In the behavioral advertising industry, there's the Digital Advertising Alliance, the DAA. When you see a behaviorally targeted ad, it's got the little triangle in the corner there. That means it's a behaviorally targeted ad. You can click that triangle to opt out. That trade association is starting to work on a compliance mechanism that would help people just for tracking cookies that are targeting ads. It's not all personal information. They actually have their summit in Washington, D.C. this Thursday, which I'm going to attend. But in terms of the way you process personal information, you have a consumer's name, email address, payment information. You're going to need to have an internal process in order to respond to requests. And if you get 1, 2, 3 requests a month, all right, you can deal with that on a manual basis. But think if you got 5,000 requests in a month, how would you respond to that? And under the law, you have a specific amount of time to respond to that request. Otherwise, the Attorney General could come after you for statutory damages.
Any other questions?
Yeah. How would this new law in California mesh with other legal requirements? Like, if you get an audit and you have to produce information about customer purchases for the last number of years and things like that, and the customer tells you, wipe out all my data.
That's a good question. This law has a lot of problems. The very, very, very short history of how this came about was there was a very wealthy California real estate developer And he was at a cocktail party one night talking to a Google engineer. And he said to the Google engineer, "Do you guys know a lot of information about us?" And I guess it was the wine the engineer spilled. He goes, "Oh, you have no idea what we know about you. We know everything." And so this guy, who's a real estate developer, funded a ballot initiative to get a law put on the ballot that California residents would vote on. And the law was horrific for industry. So bad, awful. So he negotiated with the California legislature because they wanted to get something different. And he said to the legislature, "If you passed a law by the end of June 2018, I'll withdraw my ballot initiative." So the California legislature passed a law unanimously. They wrote it in 1 week. It's got typos. It's got things that make absolutely no sense, and that's why we've been in this crazy scramble. GDPR took over 2 years of discussion before it was even drafted, and then another 2 years before implementation. California did this in a week. And so it's got a lot of things that are a mess in there. There are a lot of pending amendments right now that try and clarify things, and the California Attorney General is supposed to issue regulations by the fall to explain how a lot of this works. So to your point, there are a lot of problems in there. There are some carve-outs for things such as security or protecting the welfare of somebody, but there's a lot of problems. One specific problem, it covers employee data. The way it defines a California consumer, it includes employees. So starting next year, an employee can contact their company and say, "Hey, I want to know all the data you have on me. Everyone who's filed a complaint about me, every record about me." It can be a nightmare. There's a pending amendment to carve out employees because it's one of the many problems, but that's what happens when you pass a law in 1 week.
I guess if Google ever find that engineer, then his job security might be...
We don't know who the engineer is,
Yeah.
but the wealthy real estate developer, he was the college roommate of one of my partners at my firm.
So, I mean, what would be, do you think, the most important piece of advice that you could give the audience today around CCPA? Because it's being enacted on the 1st of January next year, but it doesn't actually get enforced. Is it 6 months later?
Yeah. So the law is effective January 1st, 2020, but they've already passed an amendment to say that the Attorney General won't enforce it until the earlier of 6 months after that date or when they issue regulations. So it's probably enforcement's going to start maybe March or April, depending on when the regulations come out. So what I'm seeing my clients do right now is first thing they're doing is they're getting a handle on what personal information they have, where it's coming from, and where it's going. Sort of that data mapping, that data inventory, because you can't respond to these requests if you don't know what you have. So get a handle on that. The things that I don't see clients doing, they're waiting until the regulations come out in the fall, is what do I need to provide an opt-out from? Because it's kind of hard until we get a little more clarity on that. But I see a lot of clients, again, depends on the scope and the size of the client, are doing this data mapping, data discovery, vendor analysis process right now, so that when those regulations come out in the fall and it says you must provide an opt-out for the following issues, you know what you have and you know where it's located and how to access it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, if people want to kind of find out more, you're hosting a roundtable, are you? Or are you going to be out and about in the kind of rooms afterwards?
Yes. So I have a roundtable tomorrow. I've been assigned table 13. I don't know if 13 is a reflection on this issue. But yes, I will be at the roundtable tomorrow, and I'm around the rest of today as well.
Okay, great. Well, you can check out more of Gary's views, not just on CCPA, but also a host of other regulatory kind of subjects within the report as part of the Q&A, as well as our other legal counsels for the UK and Italy. And like I said, if you want to catch up with him, then obviously you can find him later at the event. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Gary.
Thank you.